The whole town of Blackstone Ridge had already decided Eleanor Hayes was finished. 30 years old, a widow, no children, no prospects, just flour on her hands and a bakery that smelled like the only good thing left in her life. They smiled at her face and whispered behind her back, "Poor Eleanor. Such a shame. Some women just aren't meant for happiness." And then a man walked through her door, a man who never explained himself to anyone, and everything those people thought they knew began to crack. This is not a story about luck. It's about what happens when a woman who was written off decides she isn't finished yet. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. Like, subscribe, and stay until the very end. You'll understand why when you get there. The bread always burned a little on the bottom. Eleanor had never figured out why. She'd been using the same cast iron oven for 4 years, loading it with the same amount of pine wood every morning before the sun came up, and still, every third batch, the bottom crust came out darker than she intended. Not ruined, just imperfect. She'd stopped apologizing for it years ago. Character, she called it, when Mrs. Pruitt wrinkled her nose. Carelessness, Mrs. Pruitt called it back, dropping her coin on the counter without looking Eleanor in the eye. That was how most transactions worked in Eleanor's bakery. Coins on the counter, bread in the basket, eyes somewhere else. She didn't take it personally anymore. Or maybe she did, and had simply gotten so good at swallowing it that she could no longer tell the difference. The bakery occupied the narrow ground floor of a 2-story building on Ridgeline Street, wedged between the post office on one side and a feed supply store on the other. The building itself belonged to a man named Gerald Pratt, who lived 3 streets over and collected the rent on the first of every month with the quiet efficiency of a man who expected the money to be there and was mildly annoyed whenever it was. Eleanor had never been late, not once. She was proud of that, even though she suspected Gerald Pratt had never noticed. The front room held 4 small tables, though she rarely had more than 2 occupied at the same time. She'd sewn the curtains herself from flour sacks bleached white and hemmed crooked. She was a baker, not a seamstress. A small chalkboard beside the door listed the day's offerings in her blocky, unpretty handwriting. She'd never had the delicate penmanship the schoolteacher had tried to beat into her as a girl. Sourdough loaf, that's 8 cents. Cornbread, 5 cents. Apple hand pie, 6 cents. Coffee, 2 cents. She made the coffee strong enough to wake the dead, which was one of the things people actually complimented her on, without reservation. By 6 in the morning on the second Tuesday of October, Eleanor had already been awake for 3 hours. She'd punched down the sourdough starter at 3:15, shaped 4 loaves by 4, stoked the oven at 4:30, and pulled the first batch at 5:30. The rhythm of it lived in her body now, the way breathing did. Unconscious, automatic, reliable. She didn't have to think about any of it, which meant she had plenty of space in her head for things she'd rather not think about. The anniversary was in 4 days. She knew better than to let it sneak up on her, so she'd been watching it come from a distance the way you watch a storm move across the plains. Visible long before it arrives. Nothing you can do but wait for it. 4 years since James had died. 4 years since the wagon wheel had cracked on the mountain road above the ridge and sent her husband down a 40-foot embankment with the horse still tangled in the traces. They'd been married 11 months. He'd been 28 years old and had laughed at everything. Genuinely, easily, sometimes annoyingly. And she had loved that about him even when it drove her to madness. People had been very kind for about 6 months after the funeral, and then they had moved on, the way people do. And Eleanor had found herself standing in the middle of her grief like a woman left behind at a train station, watching everyone else's lives pull away from the platform while she stood there still holding her ticket. She'd opened the bakery 14 months after James died. It was not, as people assumed, some kind of healing exercise. It was simpler than that. She had $12, she knew how to bake, and she needed to eat. The romanticism came later, applied by other people who needed her story to have a prettier shape than it actually did. The truth was she'd bought the flour and the starter and the oven with shaking hands, and a terror in her chest that she still felt sometimes when the rent was due, and she'd had a slow week. She was not brave. She was just stubborn, which was not the same thing, no matter what people said. The morning rush, such as it was, came between 6:30 and 8. Miners heading up the North Road, ranch hands passing through town on supply runs, the occasional traveling salesman who needed something more substantial than what the hotel dining room offered at that hour. Eleanor worked the counter alone. She'd tried hiring a girl the previous spring, a 15-year-old named Dottie Marsh who was cheerful and willing, but who had a habit of giving people extra change because she was nervous about subtraction. Eleanor had done the math after 2 weeks and let her go gently, pressing an extra $1 into the girl's hand and telling her to practice her arithmetic. She hadn't had help since. She was pouring coffee for Bill Gantry, the postmaster, when the bell above the door rang and a man she didn't immediately recognize walked in. He stopped just inside the doorway like he wasn't sure he had the right place. He was tall, not dramatically so, but tall enough that he ducked slightly out of habit when he came through the frame, even though the clearance was fine. He had the kind of weathered face that made it difficult to guess age, somewhere between 35 and 45, with deep lines at the corners of his eyes and jaw that hadn't been shaved in several days. His coat was heavy canvas, dark with trail dust, and his boots were the boots of a man who spent more time on horseback than on foot. He looked around the small room with an expression that was difficult to read. Not uncomfortable exactly, but careful, like a man who'd learned a long time ago that most places were not designed with him in mind. "Morning," Eleanor said, because someone had to. "Morning." His voice was lower than she expected and unhurried. "You got coffee?" "I do. Sit anywhere you like. He chose the table farthest from the door, which Eleanor had always noticed was what the more private sort of person did. He set his hat on the table beside him rather than on the hook by the door. Another tell. He wasn't planning to stay long. She brought the coffee over herself and set the cup down without pouring from a distance. Up close, she could see he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with last night's sleep. It was a longer kind of tired. "You passing through?" she asked, not because it was her business, but because Bill Gantry was watching from the counter and would want to know, and this was cheaper than letting him ask himself. "No," the man said. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I'm Silas Mercer. I run the Double M south of here. Came in for supplies." She knew the name. Everyone in Blackstone Ridge knew the Double M, a cattle operation that had been running for going on 12 years, one of the larger outfits in the county. She'd had no picture of the man who ran it, though. She'd imagined someone louder. "Eleanor Hayes," she said. "This is my place." He looked up at her when she said it, not with any particular expression she could name, just looked at her, like he was filing something away. "Good coffee," he said. "Thank you. Can I get bread?" She brought him a half loaf of sourdough, bottom crust slightly dark, as it happened, and a crock of butter she'd gotten in trade from the Lind farm the previous week. He ate without ceremony and without hurry, and he didn't try to make conversation, which she found herself appreciating more than she expected to. Bill Gantry left at 7:15. 2 miners came and went. A woman named Carol Sims stopped in for a corn cake and spent 6 minutes telling Eleanor about her daughter's new baby in Pueblo, which Eleanor listened to with the practiced attention of someone who understood that what the woman actually needed was to say the words out loud to someone, and that Eleanor was a reasonable substitute for a closer friend. When Carol left, Silas Mercer was the only person left in the bakery. He hadn't looked up from the table the entire time Carol was talking. Eleanor was not sure whether this was because he was genuinely absorbed in his own thoughts, or because he'd learned that other people's conversations went faster when you didn't provide them an audience to play to. She suspected the latter. "What do I owe you?" he asked, pushing back from the table. 12 cents covers it. He put a quarter on the counter and waved off the change. "I'll likely be back through town Thursday," he said. He'd picked up his hat, but hadn't put it on yet. "You're open early? 5 in the morning until I run out of things to sell?" He nodded once. Put the hat on. Left. Eleanor stood at the counter for a moment after the bell stopped ringing, trying to identify what she was feeling. It wasn't much. Just the faint, slightly suspicious sense that something unremarkable had happened that was perhaps slightly less unremarkable than it appeared. She shook it off and went to clear his table. The cup was empty. He'd eaten every crumb of the bread. The quarter sat on the counter where he'd left it. She put it in the till and went back to the oven. He came back Thursday, as he'd said, and again the following Tuesday. He always came early, always ordered coffee and bread, always paid with more than the asking price, and waved off the change. He never stayed more than 40 minutes. He never asked personal questions. He didn't tell stories about himself. He didn't fill silence with noise. What he did do was listen, when she talked. Not in a demonstrative way. He didn't lean forward or make the encouraging sounds that some people made to signal their attention. He just listened, answered when she said something that invited a response. Let the quiet sit between them without feeling the need to break it. Most people, Eleanor had noticed, were uncomfortable with silence. They filled it with whatever came to hand: opinions, observations, the weather, the price of beef, the latest minor scandal. She'd learned to offer these things up herself as a kind of social courtesy, a way of smoothing the transaction so the customer felt warm and welcome and likely to return. She didn't have to do that with Silas Mercer. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. The first time they had an actual conversation, the kind where something real was said, it was a Wednesday morning in late October, and Eleanor was in a worse mood than usual. She'd spilled a full batch of starter the night before and had to throw it out, which meant she was working with one less variety of bread and a deep background irritation that she was trying to keep from her face. It wasn't working. "You all right?" Silas said. He said it without preamble, the way he did most things. "I'm fine. You don't look fine." She turned from the counter and looked at him directly, which she didn't always do. He was watching her with that same careful expression. Not intrusive, just observant. "I ruined a batch last night," she said. "The starter. Knocked it off the shelf like an idiot and lost the whole thing." "You keep a backup?" "Of course I keep a backup. I'm not a complete—" She stopped. "Yes, I have a backup. It's just that the backup is 2 weeks younger and it changes the flavor and people notice, and I have to listen to Mrs. Pruitt tell me the bread tastes different, and I already know the bread tastes different, thank you, Agnes." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mrs. Pruitt finds something wrong with everything?" Mrs. Pruitt could find fault with the sunrise. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't fully arrive, but the territory was there. "How long to get the main starter back?" he asked. 2 to 3 weeks, if I'm careful." "That's not that long." "No," she admitted. "It's not. But it's still annoying." "It's incredibly annoying." He drank his coffee. She went back to cutting the morning bread. After a moment, he said, "I lost half my cattle last spring to a drought that hit earlier than anyone predicted. Spent 3 weeks convinced I was going to lose the whole operation." She looked up. "Didn't, obviously," he said. "Obviously. Point is—" He seemed to reconsider whether he was going to make a point. Then, "The things that feel like disasters while they're happening usually turn out to be just problems. Not the same thing." She considered this. "Did someone tell you that? Or did you figure it out yourself?" "My father. Took me about 15 years to decide he was right. And now you dispense it freely to near strangers and bakeries?" That almost smile again. "Apparently." The talk started sometime in November. Eleanor didn't hear it directly. She never did. People were more careful than that. She heard it the way you hear water seeping through a wall, not the sound itself, but the evidence of it. The way certain women dropped their voices when she approached. The way Carol Sims started a sentence and then redirected it mid-flight, like a bird that had decided a different branch was safer. She asked Vera Hollis about it, because Vera was the only woman in town who told the truth, even when it was unkind. Vera Hollis ran the dry goods store 2 doors down and had the blunt energy of a woman who'd been managing people her entire life and had stopped being diplomatic about it somewhere around age 40. "They're saying Silas Mercer's been coming to your bakery," Vera said, not looking up from the fabric she was measuring. "He has been. He likes the coffee." "They're saying it's not about the coffee." Eleanor was quiet. "And they're saying—" Vera set down her scissors and looked at her then, with something that was either sympathy or pity, and Eleanor could not immediately tell which. "That it won't amount to anything, that he'll get tired of it, or find someone younger who has more to offer." "More to offer?" Eleanor repeated. "Their words, not mine." "What are your words?" Vera picked the scissors back up. "I think people in this town have too much time and too few real problems, but I also think—" A pause. "I think you should be careful not to read more into it than what it is, for your own sake." "I haven't read anything into it," Eleanor said. "He comes in for coffee and bread, that's all." Vera looked at her with the expression of a woman who knew when other people were saying something that was technically true but incomplete. Eleanor left without buying anything, which was unusual for her. She thought about it more than she wanted to. Not about Silas specifically, or not only. She thought about the thing Vera had said, more to offer. She turned the phrase over in her mind the way you worry a stone in your hand, feeling for its edges. What did she have to offer? She had a bakery that was on good days profitable and on bad days barely solvent. She had a 2-room apartment above the shop that she kept clean but that smelled permanently of bread and yeast. She had 4 years of widowhood and the kind of self-sufficiency that developed not out of preference but out of necessity. She had flour in her hair more mornings than not, and hands that were perpetually rough, and a streak of stubbornness that had served her well precisely because it had never been required to charm anyone. She was not unaware that she was considered, by the social arithmetic of Blackstone Ridge, to be past the most convenient age for remarriage. 30 felt different out here than it did in the cities she'd gathered. In Denver or St. Louis, 30 might be a woman in her prime. In a frontier town that measured women primarily by their reproductive utility and domestic availability, 30 with no children was a category that tended to generate a specific kind of pity. She hated being pitied. She had hated it since she was 7 years old, and her mother had died of fever, and the neighbor women had looked at her with that particular look, and she had wanted to throw rocks at them. She still wanted to throw rocks sometimes. She was working on it. The boy showed up on a Monday morning in early November, and he showed up the way trouble usually showed up in Eleanor's life. Quietly, without announcement, at an inconvenient moment. He was standing outside the bakery door when she came down at 5:45 to start the morning, a small figure in a coat too large for him and boots that didn't quite match. He was trying to look like he wasn't cold, which meant he was very cold. "We're not open yet," she said. "I know." He didn't move. She looked at him. He looked at her. He was maybe 9 or 10, with dark eyes that were older than the rest of his face, and a set to his jaw that suggested he'd been told no enough times to develop a thick skin about it. "Are you hungry?" A pause, during which he conducted some kind of internal negotiation. "Yes, ma'am." She opened the door and held it. He came in. His name was Danny. Daniel Cruz, he told her, though he said it like he wasn't sure the name belonged to him. He'd been at the Harmon Ranch for 6 months, he said, working in exchange for room and board. He didn't say what had happened before the Harmon Ranch, and she didn't ask. She fed him a heel of bread and a cup of warm milk with sugar in it while the oven heated, and she watched him eat with the focused intensity of a child who wasn't sure when the next meal was coming. "You go to school?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "Can you read?" He looked at her like this was a trick question. "Some words." "Which words?" "Horse," he said. "And feed, and water." A pause. "And danger." She tried not to let her face show what she felt about that. A child who'd learned to read the words he needed for survival and nothing else. "You want to learn more?" The internal negotiation again, longer this time. "Why would you teach me?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I suppose I'd need to find out." He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. She started with the alphabet. Not recitation, she'd hated recitation as a girl, but application. She wrote words on the back of old flour sacks with a piece of coal and had him figure out the sounds himself, guiding him when he was wrong without letting him feel the wrongness too sharply. He was quick, quicker than she expected, which she supposed was her own prejudice exposing itself. She'd assumed a child who'd spent his life doing physical labor rather than sitting in a schoolroom would be slower on the page. He was not. He was in fact ferociously attentive, with the kind of focus that develops in children who've learned that inattention carries consequences. He knew 40 new words by the end of the second week. She told exactly no one about it. Not because she was hiding it, but because it felt fragile. The kind of thing that became self-conscious and therefore harder when you introduced an audience to it. She should have known Blackstone Ridge would find out anyway. Blackstone Ridge found out everything. Silas Mercer walked in one morning in the second week of November to find Danny Cruz sitting at the back table sounding out words on a flour sack while Eleanor pulled bread from the oven. He stood in the doorway for a moment, that pause he always made, taking in the scene. "That's Danny Cruz," he said, keeping his voice low enough that the boy wouldn't hear. "Yes. He's from the Harmon place." "I know. Silas looked at the boy, who was now muttering the word window to himself with fierce concentration, and something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, just shifted. Does Harmon know he's here? I don't know, Eleanor said. He comes before sunup. I feed him, and we work on letters for an hour before the rush starts. And then he goes. Harmon's not a bad man, Silas said slowly. But he's not paying much attention to that boy. I noticed. He was quiet for a moment. You doing this out of charity? She considered the question seriously. I'm doing it because he's sharp, and someone should be paying attention to that. Whether that's charity or self-interest probably depends on who you ask. Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the counter and ordered his coffee and bread, and he sat at his usual table. And he didn't say anything else about it. But the next time he came in, he put a book on the counter when he ordered, a small, battered reader, the kind used in one-room schoolhouses. He didn't make a thing of it. For the boy, he said. Eleanor picked it up. McGuffey's First Eclectic Reader. The spine was cracked and 2 pages were dog-eared, and someone had written T. Mercer inside the front cover in a careful child's hand. She looked up at him. My son's, he said. He's outgrown it. She hadn't known he had children. She realized she knew very little about him at all, which seemed strange given how often he'd been in her bakery. He had a son. There were things before the double M, before Blackstone Ridge, before this. A whole life she couldn't see the shape of. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and went to his table. Check. The afternoon she heard Mrs. Agnes Pruitt say it out loud was a Tuesday in mid-November, and Eleanor heard it because she was in the back storeroom and the 2 women at the front table didn't know she was there. I don't know what he sees in her, Mrs. Pruitt said. She had the carrying voice of a woman who believed her opinions were inherently public. He probably just likes the bread, the other woman said. Eleanor didn't recognize the voice, but placed it as possibly belonging to Frances Collier, who worked at the dressmaker's. Men don't ride into town twice a week for bread, Mrs. Pruitt said. But I'll tell you what it is. It's novelty. She's different from the women on the ranches, odd and quiet, and everyone loves a mystery for about 5 minutes. You think he'll stop coming? I think, Mrs. Pruitt said, with the authority of someone delivering a verdict she'd considered carefully, that a man like Silas Mercer is going to want someone who can give him more children. He lost his wife years ago. He's got 1 boy to run the whole ranch. He needs a family. Eleanor Hayes is 30 years old and has no children and no prospects of any, and she's been a widow so long she's practically become part of the furniture. A pause. It's sad, really, the second woman said. Very sad, Mrs. Pruitt agreed in a tone that did not sound especially sad. Eleanor stood very still in the storeroom. She was holding a tin of baking powder that she'd come back for, and her fingers had tightened around it, and she made herself loosen them deliberately, one by one, because she did not intend to dent a perfectly good tin over Agnes Pruitt. She waited until she heard the women stand to leave. She waited until the bell above the door rang and faded. Then she set the tin down on the shelf, breathed, part of the furniture. She had been called worse things, probably. She couldn't think of any at the moment, but she was confident they existed. She picked the tin back up and carried it out to the counter and measured out what she needed for the next batch, and she did not cry, which felt like a small victory. She thought about saying something to Silas, not about Mrs. Pruitt. She wasn't going to do that to herself. But she thought about acknowledging it somehow. The talk. The fact that his repeated presence in her bakery was generating a kind of narrative that neither of them had written and that both of them were presumably aware of. She almost did it on a Thursday morning when the bakery was empty and the conversation had wandered somewhere more honest than usual. They'd been talking about the winter. It was coming early, the old-timer said. The signs were all there. And he'd mentioned that the cattle drive was scheduled for before Christmas, which was going to be close. That worries you? She asked. Worries me a little, he said, which she suspected was a significant admission from a man who did not generally confess to worry. The weather or the timing? Both. Neither one alone would be the problem. She poured herself a cup of coffee, and she didn't usually drink with customers, but the morning had been cold and she'd been on her feet since 3, and sat down across from him, which she also didn't usually do. He noticed. He didn't remark on it. My father was a cattleman, she said, before he lost the herd to tick fever. I know what a bad drive can do. Silas looked at her. I didn't know that. There's a lot you don't know about me. There's a lot you don't know about me, he said, not defensively, observationally. I know you have a son named Thomas, she said, because of the book. Something in his face went briefly and carefully neutral. Tom. He's 13, lives with his grandmother in Denver while he goes to school. You miss him. A long pause. Every day. She didn't push it. She understood about missing. She had her own version of it, a different shape, and she didn't need to compare the two to know they were both real. She almost said it then. People are talking about you coming in here, but she stopped herself. Because saying it would change something, and she wasn't sure what, and because she didn't entirely know what she wanted the thing to change into. So she drank her coffee, and he finished his bread, and outside the window Blackstone Ridge went about its morning business. And for a little while the bakery was the quietest it had ever been. Chisset. The last Saturday of November, Danny Cruz read a full sentence out loud for the first time. He'd been working at a page in the McGuffey Reader, slowly, halting, his finger tracing each word. And then suddenly the halting stopped and the words connected, and he read, "The cat sat on the mat and the rat ran away." He stopped, looked up at Eleanor with an expression she would remember for a long time. Surprise that was almost fear, because good things sometimes felt dangerous when you weren't used to them. "You read that," she said. "I read that," he said slowly, like he was testing whether it was true. "You did." He looked back down at the page. Read it again, quieter this time, to himself. Then he looked up with something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. The expression of someone who has just discovered a door they didn't know existed. "What else is in here?" he asked, meaning the reader. "More sentences," she said. "Stories. More words." "How many?" "A lot." He considered this with the gravity of a small person receiving a large inheritance. "Okay," he said. Eleanor turned away to check the oven, because she had something in her eyes, and she preferred to be private about it. December came in cold and gray, and with it came a change in the quality of the silences in Eleanor's life. They were the same silences they'd always been. The silence before the oven heated, the silence of the Sunday afternoon when the bakery was closed, and the street outside was quiet and the world felt very small. But they felt different, not heavier, just populated somehow, filled with things she was noticing when she hadn't been noticing them before. She noticed that she looked up when the bell above the door rang now, in a way she hadn't last spring. She noticed that she saved the first good loaf of the morning, not consciously, not as a policy, just as something that happened. She noticed that when something went wrong with the bread, her first thought was often what she would say about it to Silas Mercer, and she noticed that she noticed this, which was one level of noticing too many. She was not foolish enough to call it anything yet. She'd been married. She knew the difference between the thing and the idea of the thing, and she was not going to mistake one for the other again just because she was lonely. But she didn't close the door on it either. She was not done. Whatever Agnes Pruitt and the rest of Blackstone Ridge had decided about her future, about what she had to offer, about the category of woman she was, and the kind of life available to that category, they had decided without asking her. She swept the flour from her floor at the end of each day and set the starter for the next morning and climbed the stairs to her small apartment and lay in the dark and thought about bread and the boy who was learning to read and a man who left his hat on the table instead of the hook. And she thought, I am not done. She thought it quietly, the way she did most things, but she thought it with certainty. On the last day of November, Silas Mercer walked into the bakery and left his handkerchief on the table. She didn't notice until after he'd gone. She was dealing with a burned batch and was not at her most observant. She found it when she cleared the table. A plain cotton square, dark navy, initialed SM in the corner in thread that had faded from what she guessed was once black. She held it for a moment. Then she put it in her apron pocket, thinking she'd return it the next time she saw him. She didn't see him for 2 weeks. She told herself she wasn't counting. She was counting. The handkerchief sat on the windowsill above the stairs each night when she came up from the bakery, and she walked past it without touching it, because she was not sentimental, and she had no reason to attach meaning to a piece of cloth that a man had simply forgotten. The bread baked every morning. The starter grew back, slowly, and by the second week in December it was close to what it had been before she'd spilled it, the flavor coming back by degrees. Danny Cruz was reading three-word sentences without hesitating. Blackstone Ridge was talking. And Eleanor Hayes, the woman they had buried before she was done living, the furniture, the sad case, the widow, went to sleep every night above her bakery and woke up every morning before the sun and made bread. And waited, without quite admitting she was waiting, for the bell above the door to ring. Silas came back on a Wednesday. Eleanor was in the middle of her second batch when she heard the bell, and she told herself the way her stomach tightened was simply because she'd been leaning over the oven too long. She straightened up, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out to the front room with an expression she had carefully arranged to be ordinary. He looked the same as always, coat dusted from the road, hat in his hand, that particular stillness he carried everywhere like it was another layer of clothing. "You were gone a while," she said. She meant it to come out neutral. It came out slightly accusatory, which she immediately wished she could take back. He set his hat on the table. Fence line came down in the north pasture. Took longer than it should have. "Coffee?" "Please." She poured it and brought it over. He'd already noticed the handkerchief on the counter, but she'd placed it there that morning without entirely deciding to, just moved it from the windowsill upstairs to the counter downstairs, which she told herself was practical and nothing else. "Left that here," he said. "I noticed." He picked it up, folded it once, put it in his coat pocket. Didn't say thank you, which she'd come to understand was not rudeness but simply the way he operated. He acknowledged things without performing gratitude over them. "The boy been coming?" he asked. "Every morning." "How's he doing?" She sat down across from him, which had become less unusual over the past few weeks. "He read me a full page last Tuesday. Slowly, but he got through it, every word." Something in Silas's face did the thing it did when he was more affected than he let show. A kind of compression, like he was pressing the feeling down to a manageable size. "Good," he said. Just that. "He asked me what a paragraph was," Eleanor said. "I told him it was a collection of sentences that belonged together. He thought about it for a while and then said that sounded like a family." She paused. "I didn't know what to say to that." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Smart kid." "Very." Outside, someone was arguing with a horse. They could hear it through the wall. A man's voice, frustrated, and the uncooperative sounds of an animal that had made up its mind. Eleanor and Silas both glanced toward the window, and when they looked back at each other, there was something almost like shared amusement in the air, though neither of them quite smiled. "I heard people have been talking," he said. There it was. She'd been wondering when they would get to it. "People always talk," she said. "About you. About me coming here." "Yes." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. It was a habit she'd noticed. He held things while he thought, rotated them slowly, like the motion helped him organize something. "Does it bother you?" She considered lying and decided against it. "It bothers me that they've decided what the story is before anything has actually happened. It bothers me that the most interesting version of events, according to Agnes Pruitt, is that you'll eventually get bored and leave." She kept her voice even. "It doesn't bother me that they're talking. I stopped being able to control that a long time ago." He nodded slowly. "Same." "You've heard it too?" "Bill Harmon told me last week that I was making things complicated for you," Silas said. "He meant well. He's the kind of man who means well and says the wrong thing." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I came here for the coffee." She laughed, actually laughed, which surprised both of them slightly. It wasn't a polished sound. It came out faster than she intended, a short, genuine thing. "That's not untrue," she said. "No," he agreed, "it's not." The moment sat between them, not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. The kind of moment that has weight to it without being heavy. She didn't push it further, and neither did he. They had both, she thought, learned the particular skill of not reaching for things before they were ready to be reached for. Whether that was wisdom or cowardice probably depended on the day. He finished his coffee, paid his quarter, put on his hat. "I'll be in Friday," he said at the door. "I'll be here," she said. The same as always. The bell rang, the door closed. Eleanor stood at the counter for a moment, then went back to her bread. The second batch had come out nearly perfect. She didn't read anything into it, much. The weeks before Christmas moved the way weeks before winter always did in that country. Fast and cold and slightly chaotic, with a quality of compressed time, everyone trying to finish the things that couldn't wait any longer before the snow came down hard and made everything harder. Eleanor kept her hours and baked her bread and worked with Danny 3 mornings a week now, instead of daily, because the Harmon Ranch had noticed his early absences, and Amos Harmon had come in one morning with the expression of a man who wasn't sure whether to be angry or grateful. He'd stood at the counter with his hat in his hands. Men always held their hats when they didn't know what to do with themselves, and said, "I understand you've been teaching the boy." "I have," Eleanor said. She did not apologize and did not explain. She waited. Amos Harmon was in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered past the point where you could read much in it. He looked at her for a long moment. "He's not my son," he said finally. "He came with the property, more or less. His mother worked for the previous owner and she passed, and nobody came for him, and I kept him on because he works hard." A pause. "I should have paid more attention." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You should have." He blinked, apparently not expecting that. "But he's catching up fast," she added. "If you can spare him 3 mornings a week before the rush, I'll keep at it." Amos Harmon turned his hat once in his hands. "What do you want in return?" "I want him to learn to read properly. That's all." He looked at her for another long moment, in the way that men sometimes looked at women who said things directly, like they were trying to find the hidden request underneath the stated one and were confused when it wasn't there. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on. 3 mornings. He bought a corn cake on his way out, which felt like his version of a peace offering. The town had mixed feelings about the teaching arrangement, which Eleanor discovered slowly, in pieces. Some people thought it was admirable. A few, fewer than she expected, said so to her face. Others seemed to find it presumptuous, as though she had stepped into a role that wasn't hers. One woman whose name Eleanor refused to commit to memory suggested that Eleanor was trying to make herself look important by educating a ranch orphan, which was the kind of observation that said considerably more about the woman making it than the woman it was aimed at. Vera Hollis told her, mid-December, that the general opinion had shifted in a way that was grudgingly favorable. "People respect it," Vera said. "Not all of them, but the ones who matter." "I'm not doing it for their respect," Eleanor said. "I know you're not. That's why you have it." On the last Friday before Christmas, Danny read Eleanor a full 2-page story from the McGuffey Reader. He did it sitting at the back table while she rolled out the morning pastry, his voice gaining confidence with each line, until by the end he was reading with something that was almost fluency, stumbling here and there, backing up and self-correcting, but moving forward. When he finished, he looked up. "Was that good?" he asked. "That was very good," she said. He nodded, processing this. Then, "Miss Hayes?" "Yes." "Are you going to teach me until I can read everything, like newspapers and such?" She set down the rolling pin. "If you keep coming." "I'll keep coming," he said, with the particular firmness of a child making a promise he intends to keep because he's had too many broken ones to take them lightly. She went back to the pastry. "Yes," she said. "I'll teach you everything." Christmas came and went quietly. Eleanor spent the day baking things she didn't sell, not for any particular reason, just because baking was how she managed feelings she couldn't otherwise do anything about, and the holiday had a way of surfacing feelings she'd done an adequate job of burying the rest of the year. James had loved Christmas with an enthusiasm she'd found slightly exhausting, and then, after he was gone, had missed so much it was like an actual physical absence in the room. She gave Danny a pocket dictionary she'd ordered from the supply catalog 3 weeks before. She wrapped it in brown paper and left it for him on the back table on Christmas Eve morning. And when he opened it, he held it for a long time without saying anything, and then said, "This has every word?" "Most of them." He put it in the inside pocket of his coat against his chest, where he kept things he didn't want to lose. Silas Mercer did not come in for 2 weeks around Christmas, the cattle drive preparation she assumed, and the demands of the season on a working ranch. She didn't expect him, and told herself she wasn't missing him, and moved on with the business of December. She was partway through the business of convincing herself of all this, when the new year turned and January came in gray and mean, and then February, and the ordinary machinery of life ground forward the way it always did. Then March arrived, and everything broke. Eleanor found out about the building on a Tuesday morning, the 4th of March, when Gerald Pratt knocked on her door at 7:30 while she still had customers at the tables. He knocked the way he always did, 2 sharp raps, businesslike, as if the door owed him something. She opened it. He was wearing his good coat, which meant he'd come to deliver news he wanted insulation from. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Mr. Pratt." She stepped aside to let him in, or started to, but he stayed on the step. "I won't come in," he said. "I just need to tell you something, and I thought it was better to say it in person." She waited. He looked briefly at the middle distance, the way people did when the thing they were about to say was going to be uncomfortable, and they wanted somewhere else to put their eyes. "I've sold the building," he said, "to the Territorial Land and Commerce Company, out of Denver." Eleanor heard it. She waited for the meaning to arrive, and then it did, and it was cold. "When?" she said. "The sale was finalized in January." He had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "They've been buying properties along Ridgeline Street. Several of them. They want to consolidate the block." "For what?" "A freight depot, I'm told. Or possibly a company storehouse. The details—" He waved a hand. "The details aren't entirely clear to me. When do I have to leave?" He did look at her then. He had the face of a man who was going to remember this conversation for a while. 90 days, from March 1st. March 1st was 4 days ago. "Yes," he said. "I know. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I should have told you sooner. They moved faster than I anticipated." She noticed she was holding the door frame. She let go of it. 86 days, she said. "What?" "From today. I have 86 days. Gerald Pratt looked at her with the expression of a man watching something he expected to collapse, not collapse. "I truly am sorry," he said again. "You have been," she said. "Every month for 4 years." She stepped back. "Excuse me, I have customers." She closed the door. She stood behind it for exactly 3 seconds, breathing, and then she went back to the counter and refilled Bill Gantry's coffee and told him his change from a 10-cent piece was 2 cents and managed to sound like a person who had not just been told the ground was being removed from beneath her feet. Bill left at 8:05. She was alone in the bakery. She sat down at the nearest table, which she almost never did, and looked at the room around her. The curtains she'd hemmed crooked, the chalkboard with today's prices in her blocky writing, the 4 tables and the oven she'd learned to read by sound, and the particular smell of the place that had lived in her clothes and her hair for 4 years. She'd built this. Not from nothing. She'd had the flour and the starter and $12, but from close enough to nothing that the difference didn't feel meaningful. She'd built it in the year after the worst year of her life, when she'd had nothing except the knowledge that she could make bread and the stubbornness to see whether that was enough. And now a company in Denver had decided the building it lived in was more valuable as a freight depot. 86 days. She put both hands flat on the table. She pressed down, feeling the grain of the wood under her palms. She breathed in the smell of the place. Then she stood up and went to check the oven. She told Vera Hollis the next day, because Vera would need to know, and because telling Vera meant she only had to say it once. Vera had a network of information that rivaled the telegraph for speed and efficiency. Vera listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. "Do you have savings?" she asked when Eleanor finished. "Some. Not enough to buy a building." "What about renting somewhere else?" "I've been looking." She had since 7 the previous evening, when she'd walked the length of Ridgeline Street and the 2 cross streets and calculated what she knew about what was available. "There isn't much. The Tyler building on 2nd Street has a space, but it's half the size and needs work I can't afford." "Could you do half the business?" "I could do half the business and lose 1/3 of my customers because they won't walk an extra block." She said it without bitterness. It was simply true. "And then I'd be trying to keep the starter going in a kitchen that isn't built for it." Vera was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor said, which was the most honest thing she'd said in several days. Vera put her hand briefly on Eleanor's arm, a gesture so unusual from Vera that it landed harder than it would have from anyone else. "Tell me when you know," Vera said. The next time Silas came in, Eleanor almost didn't tell him. It wasn't his problem. She didn't want to be a problem that needed solving, which was a particular sensitivity of hers that she recognized as not always rational, but felt strongly about regardless. But she'd been carrying the 86 days, now 73, around with her like a stone in her boot, and she was tired. And he came in on a Friday morning when the weather was especially miserable and the bakery was empty of other customers. And he looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. He listened the way he always listened, without filling in the pauses, without offering solutions before she'd finished talking. He let her say the whole thing, the building and the company and the 90 days and the Tyler space that was too small and the savings that weren't enough. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Have you heard of the Territorial Land and Commerce Company before?" he said. "No." "I have." He said it carefully, like he was measuring each word. "They've been active in 3 counties, buying up commercial property on main streets, offering sellers good money, and then—" He paused. "There are rumors." "What kind of rumors?" "That not all the purchases have been entirely clean." He set down his cup. "There's a man named Aldrich Cole who runs the operation. He moves fast and he doesn't tend to take no for an answer." The name meant nothing to her. "Is he dishonest?" "I don't know that I can say that," Silas said. "I can say I've heard things that made me cautious. Other ranchers who've dealt with his company have had complications." She digested this. "That doesn't help me with my 86 days." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She refilled his coffee without being asked, which was something she only did for him. He waited until she'd sat back down. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. He turned the coffee cup in his hands twice. Stopped. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this," he started, and then stopped again. He had the expression of a man who prepared for most things, but had not adequately prepared for this particular moment. She waited. "I've been coming here since October," he said. "Twice a week, most weeks. And I know people have been talking, and I know it's put you in an uncomfortable position, and I—" He looked at the table, then back at her. "I'm not good at this. I want you to know I know that." "At what?" she said, because she needed him to say it. "At saying the thing." He exhaled slowly. "My wife died 7 years ago, fever. And I spent a long time after that being very certain that I wasn't looking for anything else. And then I came in here in October for coffee. I could have gotten at the hotel and—" He stopped, set the cup down. "I have no speeches prepared." "I noticed," she said. "I have a ranch that's working and a son who's coming home in June and a life that has some good things in it and some significant problems." He met her eyes. "I'd like to know if any of those things might include you, in a formal capacity." The silence that followed was the longest one they'd ever shared. Eleanor was aware of her heartbeat in a way that she normally was not. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I am," he said. "Badly." "You're asking me badly?" "Yes." She looked at him, at the careful, weathered face and the hands that held the coffee cup and the honest discomfort of a man saying a thing he'd never been good at saying. "Why?" she said. He seemed to expect a different response than that. "Because I—" "Not why you're asking," she said. "Why now? You've been coming in since October. You could have said something sooner." He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't have a reason that would make sense until now." "And now you do. You're about to lose the bakery," he said. "If we were married, you'd have the ranch. You could build a kitchen that's actually made for what you do. We have the space." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking out of pity. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking because it's a thing I've been wanting to ask, and now there's a practical reason too. And I thought combining the two might make it easier to say." Eleanor looked at the table, at her hands on it, flowers still in the creases of her knuckles. She thought about what she'd told herself in December. "I am not done." She thought about Agnes Pruitt's voice through the storeroom wall, part of the furniture. She thought about James, who had laughed at everything, and the 11 months of marriage that had been enough to know what it felt like to be known by someone. She thought about a man who had left his handkerchief on her table and then not come back for 2 weeks, and who she had told herself she wasn't counting the days for, while very clearly counting the days. "I need to think about it," she said. Something in him settled. Not disappointment exactly. More like a man who had placed a bet he was uncertain about and was now waiting to see the result without being sure he deserved to know it yet. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "It might be a few days." "That's fine." It's a significant question. I know it is. She looked at him. Do you actually want this? Not because of the bakery, not because of the practicality. He held her eyes without looking away. I wouldn't have asked if I didn't. People say things they mean in the moment, she said. That's not the same as meaning them all the way through. No, he agreed. It's not. I can't prove the difference to you. Not today. He paused. That's probably not very reassuring. It's actually more reassuring than if you'd told me you were certain of everything, she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between surprised and quietly grateful. She stood up, went to the oven and checked the bread, which didn't need checking because she needed to do something with her hands, and this was the nearest available thing. Thursday, she said, with her back to him. Thursday? Come in Thursday. I'll have an answer for you. She heard him stand, heard him put on his coat. She didn't turn around because her face was doing something she preferred he not see yet. Thursday, he said. The bell rang. Eleanor stood at the oven with both hands on the iron door, the heat against her palms, the smell of bread rising around her. 73 days. A question she hadn't asked for and couldn't stop turning over, and the particular, terrifying, quietly thrilling sensation of a life that had just, without permission, become uncertain in a completely different direction than it had been uncertain before. She pulled the bread from the oven, set it on the rack, looked at it. The bottom crust was slightly dark. She didn't apologize for it. Thursday came the way significant days always came, unremarkably, just another gray morning with frost on the window glass, and the oven needing to be stoked and the starter needing to be checked. All the ordinary machinery of the day running whether Eleanor was ready for it or not. She'd been awake since 2, not the useful kind of awake, where you lie in the dark and think things through to their conclusions. The useless kind, where you turn the same thoughts over and over until they're worn smooth and still don't give you an answer. She'd gotten up at 3, gone downstairs, and started the bread an hour earlier than necessary, because at least flour and heat were things she understood. By the time Silas walked in at 7:15, she had baked 2 full batches, scrubbed the front counter twice, and reorganized the supply shelf in the back room, which she'd been meaning to do for approximately 6 months. He came in, stopped in the doorway the way he always did, looked at her. She looked at him. Sit down, she said. I'll get the coffee. He sat. She poured. She brought the cups to the table and sat across from him and put her hands flat on the wood and said, without preamble, because she had decided somewhere around 4 in the morning that she was done with preamble. Yes. Silas was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face. Relief, she thought, or something adjacent to it, the particular expression of a man who'd been braced for a specific impact and was recalibrating to the absence of it. Yes, he said, like he was making sure he'd heard correctly. Yes, but I need you to understand what you're getting. She kept her voice even. I'm not easy to live with. I am particular about my kitchen. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I don't drop them simply because someone disagrees with me. I'm not going to become a different person because I'm on a ranch instead of a bakery. I'm not asking you to, he said. I need to be able to bring the starter, the whole setup. There's a building near the main house we use for storage. It can be converted. She paused. You thought about this already. I've been thinking about it since October, he said, and the simple directness of it landed somewhere in her chest. She nodded once. And I want to keep teaching Danny. That's got nothing to do with me. It might eventually. He's going to need more than I can give him in morning sessions. He should be in a proper school. I'll talk to Harmon, Silas said. She looked at him across the table, at the face she'd been reading in pieces for months without knowing she was doing it, and she felt the strange doubling of a moment that was both smaller and larger than she'd expected. She had imagined, when she was younger, that the significant moments of a life would feel more ceremonial than this, that they would arrive with some kind of internal music. They didn't. They arrived looking like an ordinary Thursday morning with coffee going cold between 2 imperfect people who had no idea what they were doing. All right, she said. All right, he said. They got married 6 days later. The ceremony was at the county clerk's office, which smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco and had a single window that faced a brick wall. The clerk was a thin man named Edwin Bosch, who performed the service with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done it many times and had stopped attaching sentiment to it. Vera Hollis stood on Eleanor's side because Eleanor asked her, and because Vera would not have forgiven her if she hadn't. A ranch hand named Pete Dalloway stood with Silas, a broad-shouldered man of few words who pumped Eleanor's hand afterward with great sincerity and said, "He's a decent man, ma'am. That's about all I can tell you," which Eleanor found more reassuring than any longer speech would have been. They did not have a wedding dinner. They had coffee at Eleanor's bakery, her bakery, still, for the weeks remaining on the lease, because it was the most natural place they both knew how to be, and because neither of them was the kind of person who required a celebration to make a thing feel real. Mrs. Pruitt found out before noon. Eleanor knew this because by 1 o'clock the traffic past her bakery window had taken on the particular pattern of people walking past twice, once to confirm the report, and once because they hadn't quite believed it the first time. She did not go out to address this. She baked bread and let the town do what the town was going to do. The move to the Double M took 2 weeks to arrange. Eleanor had more to pack than she expected and less help than she'd thought she'd need, the two things balancing out imperfectly, the way most things did. She took the oven apart piece by piece, and Silas sent 2 ranch hands with a wagon to carry it, which was the most romantic gesture she received in the process, though she didn't say so. The building near the main house was, as Silas had said, a storage space, rough-framed, with a dirt floor and a roof that needed one patch on the south corner. She stood in the middle of it and tried to see what it could become instead of what it was. "I need the floor planked," she said, "and a proper flue for the oven. And more light. That north wall needs another window." Silas was in the doorway. "That's manageable. And a cold shelf for the butter and the eggs. Not outside, inside, with a vent to keep the temperature." He wrote nothing down. He just listened in the way he did. The kind of listening that she'd learned to trust actually went somewhere. "Give me 3 weeks," he said. It took 4. She had not expected 3, but she'd said 3 as the optimistic number, the number you state to a contractor when what you mean is 5. 4 was fine. By the time April was properly underway, Eleanor had a kitchen on the Double M that was better than anything she'd had on Ridgeline Street. The flue drew cleanly. The floor was solid plank over tamped earth. The window faced east, which meant morning light hit the work counter straight on. She stood in it the first morning after the oven had been properly cured and felt something that she was not going to call happiness, exactly, more like competence, which was a feeling she trusted more. She fired the first batch from the new kitchen on a Monday morning. Sourdough, because it was the thing she knew best and because she needed a baseline. She sat down at the small table she'd brought from the bakery. She'd kept one of the 4, it fit in the corner, and drank coffee and waited for the bread to tell her what the oven did. The bottom crust came out slightly dark. She looked at it for a long moment. "Character," she said to nobody, and put it on the rack. The ranch changed around her presence in ways she hadn't anticipated and wouldn't have predicted. She'd expected to be peripheral, a woman in a back building, making bread, staying out of the operation she didn't understand. What happened instead was more complicated and more human than that. The ranch hands ate. They ate every day, 3 times a day, and the cook who managed it was a man named Clyde, who had been doing it for 8 years with adequacy and no particular joy. He was not a bad cook. He was the kind of cook who kept people fed without inspiring any feelings about the food one way or the other. Eleanor started bringing bread in the mornings. Not as a policy, not as an announcement, just because she was making it anyway, and there was more than 2 people could eat, and it seemed wasteful to let it go. The first morning, she left a loaf on the cookhouse table and said nothing about it. The second morning, 2 of the hands stopped to say something to her when they passed the kitchen building, which was the first time they had done that. By the 3rd week, 3 of the hands were taking morning coffee at the small table in her kitchen while she worked, which happened gradually enough that she couldn't identify the moment it became normal. They were not intrusive. They seemed to understand that the kitchen was her space and that being allowed in it was a specific kind of privilege. They talked when she talked and were quiet when she was quiet, and they told her things about the ranch she wouldn't have learned any other way. She learned that the North Pasture had a creek that flooded unpredictably in spring and had cost them 2 calves the previous year. She learned that Pete Dalloway, the man who'd stood with Silas at the ceremony, had a brother in Kansas City who sent him newspaper clippings of sporting events that Pete read so thoroughly they were in pieces by the end. She learned that 3 of the 8 hands had been with Silas for more than 5 years. which said something about him that he would never have said about himself. What she learned about Silas himself came slowly, in pieces, the way she suspected it would always come. He was not a man who explained himself. He showed up in the kitchen some evenings when the work was done and sat at the small table and drank coffee, and sometimes he talked and sometimes he didn't, and she had adjusted to both states without finding either one unbearable. He was not easy to live with, she discovered. He was particular about the ranch in ways that occasionally made her want to throw something. He had strong opinions about which tasks needed doing in what order, and he communicated these opinions in the least efficient way possible, which was to do the tasks himself in a pointed way that he apparently believed was self-explanatory. She had told him, after the third instance of this, that if he wanted something done differently, he would need to say so out loud using actual words in an actual sentence addressed to an actual person. He had looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been told something obvious in a way that made it clear it was not, in fact, obvious to him. "That's fair," he said. "It's not a question of fair," she said. "It's a question of me not being able to read your mind." "I know," he said. "I'm used to—" He stopped. "What?" "Working with people who've been around long enough to know what I want without me saying it." "That takes years," she said. "I know. So you're going to need to say the thing." He looked at her steadily. "That's going to be difficult for me." "I believe it," she said. "Say it anyway." He did after that. Not perfectly, not without visible effort, but he said it. She considered that a meaningful development. She said the things she needed to say too, which was occasionally easier than she'd expected and occasionally harder, because honesty required a different kind of courage when you actually had something to lose. They were, she thought, two people building a language between them. It was halting and imprecise, and sometimes they got it completely wrong, but it was theirs, and she thought it would eventually be sufficient. The cattle drive was set for the second week of November. Eleanor had known about it since before the wedding. Silas had mentioned it the morning he proposed, as one of the significant facts of the year, the way a farmer might mention harvest season. The Double M drove their cattle to the railhead at Fort Benner every autumn, a 5-day ride into increasingly rough country as the season turned. This year, Silas had pushed the timing earlier than usual because the signs of early winter were everywhere. The old-timers reading the animal behavior, the color of the sky at certain hours, the feel of the air. She didn't say she was worried. She didn't think he would want her to say it, and she wasn't sure it would help anything if she did. Instead, she did what she always did with worry, which was convert it into action. She spent 3 days preparing food for the drive. Not just staples, she made things that would keep and that would be worth eating, hardtack that was actually edible rather than jaw-breaking, smoked meat that she'd arranged a trade for with the Lynns, dried apple pieces coated in a little sugar, jerked beef that she'd done herself in the kitchen over 2 days. She packed it carefully into the saddlebags and supply pack, and when Silas saw the volume of it, he raised both eyebrows. "This is a lot," he said. 5 days, she said. 7 men. Cold weather coming. "We usually take half this." "And you usually come back hungry," Pete Dalloway said, from somewhere behind Silas, and received a look for it. The morning of the drive, Eleanor was up at 3, which was her usual time, and Silas found her in the kitchen at 4:30 when he came in to get his gear. She'd made proper breakfast, eggs, bread, coffee, a pan of salt pork, and had it on the table without ceremony. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his trail coat and looked at the table and then at her. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down and eat before it's cold." He sat. She sat across from him. They ate without much conversation, the way they'd learned to eat together, companionably, without requiring it to mean anything beyond what it was. Outside, she could hear the ranch beginning to stir, the horses being brought up, the hands getting ready. He finished and pushed back from the table. Stood, put his hat on. "I'll be back in 5 days," he said. "Be careful on the ridge pass," she said. "If the weather changes—" "I know the ridge pass." "I know you know it. Be careful anyway." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face did that thing she'd learned to read by now. The compression, the feeling pressed down to a smaller size. He put out his hand and she took it, and he held it for a moment. Not dramatically, just held it, and then let go. 5 days, he said. 5 days, she said. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the riders go out in the early gray of the morning, 7 men on horseback with the cattle moving ahead of them, until the dust and the distance took them. Then she went back inside and started the bread. The snow started on the 3rd day. She knew it before she could see it, felt it in the air the way she always did, a particular quality of cold that was different from ordinary winter cold, thicker and more intentional. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, it was coming down seriously. By nightfall, it was the kind of snow that changed the character of the landscape, laying over everything and erasing the shapes of things. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at it, and the worry she'd been keeping at a manageable distance stopped being manageable. She went to find Pete Dalloway, who had stayed behind to manage the ranch with 2 other hands. "How bad does it get on the ridge pass?" she asked him. She asked it directly, without softening it, because she needed a real answer. Pete looked at the sky and then at her. "Depends on how long it lasts," he said. "The pass is protected some by the rock walls, but if this goes on past tomorrow—" He didn't finish the sentence. "They have shelter?" "There's an old cabin, about a mile past the high point. The Mercer crew has used it before." He paused. "Mr. Mercer knows where it is. If it came down hard, he'd have them pull up there." "How old is the cabin?" Pete hesitated. "How old, Pete?" "Old," he said. 16, maybe 20 years. Nobody's been up there in a while." That night she barely slept. She lay in the dark and listened to the snow against the window and ran the calculations she didn't want to be running: distance, temperature, the way exposure worked on the body, the particulars of frostbite and hypothermia that her father had told her about when she was a girl, because he'd believed women should know the things that could kill them. The storm lasted 3 days. By the 6th day, 1 day passed when they should have returned, the ranch hands began checking the road east every few hours. Pete Dalloway was visibly managing his own worry, doing it with the particular efficiency of a man who'd been doing it longer than Eleanor had been alive. On the 7th day, a rider came back. His name was Cole Whitfield, one of the younger hands, and he came in on a horse that had been pushed hard, his face raw from the cold. Eleanor was at the door of the main house before he'd fully dismounted. "Mr. Mercer?" she said. Whitfield's face was difficult to read. "We got separated, ma'am. The snow came down fast on the backside of the ridge, and visibility went to nothing. We got the cattle to the lower ground and waited out the worst of it, but—" He stopped. "But—" He went back up for Davis, one of the hands who'd fallen behind. "We waited at the lower camp for 2 days. He didn't come back down." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the horse breathing. "Search parties?" she said. "We sent 2. The second one found Davis. He'd made it to a rock shelf and sheltered there. He's all right. Cold, but all right." Whitfield looked at her with the eyes of a young man who did not want to be the one saying what he was saying. "We couldn't find Mr. Mercer." The next 6 hours were the worst of her life, or close to it. People came. The ranch hands gathered. Someone, she couldn't remember who, had sent word to town, and by mid-morning there were men in the yard talking about search routes, which passes were accessible, how long a man could survive if he'd found any kind of shelter. Eleanor stood in the middle of all of it and listened and did not fall apart, which cost her something she couldn't name. She heard the word survive used twice in context that made clear people were beginning to calculate odds, and both times something in her went very cold and very focused. On the 2nd day after Whitfield returned, a formal search party came back without him. "Mrs. Mercer," the search leader said, "a man named Galt from town, who organized these things with professional competence and professional distance. We've covered the accessible ridge area. The upper pass is still blocked. We'll try again when the snow settles." "When will that be?" 3, maybe 4 days. She looked at him. "And what are his chances after 3 more days?" Galt looked at her the way men looked at women when they were about to say something they believed was kind and was actually condescending. "Ma'am, don't," she said. What are his chances?" A pause. "If he found shelter, if he had food, if the temperature doesn't drop further." He stopped. "They're not impossible." It was not comfort. It was a calculation, and she would take a calculation over false comfort every time. That night, after the ranch had gone quiet, and Pete was asleep in the bunkhouse, and the snow had stopped for the first time in days, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and made her own calculation. She knew the ridge. Not the way Silas knew it, not the way the ranch hands knew it, but she'd listened carefully every time anyone had described it. She knew the lower camp and the upper pass and the fact that there was a cabin a mile past the high point that was old and possibly unusable and possibly the only thing standing between Silas Mercer and the cold. She thought about the food she'd packed, 5 days' worth. He'd been up there 9. She thought about Danny Cruz reading a full page from the McGuffey reader and saying, was that good? Like he needed permission to believe in his own success. She thought about a man who turned a coffee cup in his hands when he was thinking. She thought about 5 days said in a kitchen at 4:30 in the morning and the way he'd held her hand before he left. She got up from the table. She went and knocked on the bunkhouse door until Pete Dalloway opened it, squinting in the cold. I need you to tell me exactly how to get to that cabin, she said. Pete looked at her, looked at the sky behind her, which was clear now, the stars very bright and very cold. Mrs. Mercer, Pete. He was quiet for a moment. You're not going to sleep until someone goes up there, he said. I'm not going to sleep. And if you won't tell me, I'll go without knowing, and that will be worse for everyone. Another long moment. He looked at the sky again, reading it the way men who'd lived in this country all their lives read it. Snow's done, he said. Yes. Cold, but manageable. Yes, he exhaled. Give me 10 minutes to get dressed, he said. I'm coming with you. She had not expected that. She looked at him, this broad-shouldered, plain-spoken man who had told her on her wedding day that Silas was decent, and that was about all he could tell her. You don't have to, she said. I know I don't, he said. 10 minutes. They left before dawn, 2 riders on the frozen trail with enough food and blankets for 4 people, because Eleanor had packed for 4 people without entirely deciding to. The cold was the kind that made the air feel brittle, the kind that burned your face and made your eyes water immediately. She did not think about what they might find. She thought about the next footfall and the one after that, and the particular quality of paying attention that got you through difficult terrain without catastrophizing, a skill her father had taught her and she'd spent 20 years thinking she'd never need. The upper pass was passable, barely. The snow was packed hard and the horses were careful about it, but passable. They found the cabin exactly where Pete said it would be, a low structure of dark timber nearly buried in the drift, barely visible against the white. Eleanor dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. She reached the door and pushed it. It resisted, snow packed against the base, and she hit it with her shoulder and it gave and she went in. It was dark inside, cold, but not the same cold as outside. There had been a fire at some point. The smell of smoke was present, old and faint. She let her eyes adjust. He was in the back corner, wrapped in what appeared to be his coat and a saddle blanket, and possibly every piece of clothing he had with him. And he was alive. She could see the rise and fall, but he did not look like a man who had much left. Silas, she said. His eyes opened. Slowly, with the particular difficulty of a person who is very cold and very tired, and has been alone long enough that the presence of another person takes a moment to process. He looked at her. Eleanor, he said. His voice was rough and very quiet. Yes, she said. She was already moving toward him, pulling the blanket from the pack on her back. I've got you. Don't try to get up. How? He stopped, swallowed. How did you find me? Pete told me about the cabin. She was wrapping the blanket around him, assessing, hands, face, the signs she knew to look for. His fingers were cold but not the wrong color. His face was wind-burned and cracked. His lips were dry. He was exhausted in a way that went past physical. Can you feel your feet? Yes. A pause. They hurt. Good. That's good. Feeling is good. She heard Pete behind her taking stock of the space, and she heard the older man let out a breath that carried a long time's worth of held tension in it. Well, Pete said, after a moment. He looks like hell. Thank you, Pete, Silas said, with a thread of something that was almost dry humor, and Eleanor felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. She reached into the pack and pulled out the food she'd brought. There's no water I can heat, she said, looking around the cabin. There's snow, Silas said. There's snow, she agreed. Pete was already at the door. She sat beside Silas in the back corner of the dark cabin while Pete melted snow outside. And she gave him food in small amounts the way she knew was right when a person had been without. And she didn't say anything for a while, and neither did he. Then he said quietly, "You came yourself." "Yes." "You didn't wait for the search party. The search party couldn't find you," she said. He was quiet. "You're going to tell me it was reckless," she said. "It was reckless," he said. "I know." "I'm not going to tell you not to do it again," he said. She looked at him in the low light. "Because you'd do it anyway," he said. "And because—" He stopped. Something in his face, even roughened by cold and days of isolation, carried an expression she had no word for but understood completely. "I'm glad you did." Outside, Pete had a fire started and snow melting in the camp pan. The sound of it reached them through the cabin wall, ordinary and domestic and entirely sufficient. Eleanor pulled the blanket closer around Silas's shoulders. Neither one of them said anything else for a while. There was nothing left to say that the being there hadn't already said. Silas recovered slowly, which was the only way a person could recover from what he'd been through, and he was a terrible patient. Not dramatically terrible. He didn't complain loudly or make demands. He was terrible in the quiet way that stubborn people are terrible when forced into stillness. He kept trying to get up before he should, kept reaching for his coat, kept asking Pete about the cattle, in a tone that suggested if Pete didn't answer satisfactorily, he would go check himself regardless of what his body was doing. Eleanor told him on the third day, without particular heat but with clarity, that if he put his boots on before she said he could, she would hide them somewhere on the ranch where he would never find them. He looked at her. "You wouldn't." "Silas," she said, "you have met me." He left the boots off. His feet had come through without serious damage, cold injury, the doctor from town had called it, which was a precise description of an imprecise thing, and what it meant practically was that his toes were painful and slightly swollen for 2 weeks, and he walked with a careful deliberateness that he tried to hide and could not. His hands were worse. The skin had cracked badly across the knuckles and palms, and for the first week he couldn't hold a cup properly, which bothered him more than he said. Eleanor had seen it in his face the first morning he tried. The frustration of a man who worked with his hands, finding them temporarily unreliable. She started leaving his coffee in a tin mug instead of the ceramic ones, because the tin had a lip that was easier to grip without the handle. She didn't say anything about it. He noticed, and didn't say anything either, and she thought that was probably the correct way for both of them to handle it. The hands came by in rotation, the way working men did when one of their own was down. Not in groups, not formally, just appearing at reasonable hours with reasonable excuses. Pete came every morning to report on the ranch in a way that was technically informational and actually a check that Silas was still breathing. Whitfield came twice and stood in the doorway saying very little but staying long enough that his presence made its point. Even Clyde the cook sent food over to the main house, which was the first time in Eleanor's experience that Clyde had cooked anything intended specifically for another person's welfare rather than simple nutritional obligation. The cattle, as it turned out, had made it to the railhead. Davis had gotten them there. The hand Silas had gone back for, the reason he'd been separated from the group. Davis had come by on the 4th day after the rescue, a compact and weathered man in his 40s who stood in the front room with his hat in both hands and said to Silas, "I owe you something I can't pay back." "You don't owe me anything," Silas said. "You went back up for me." "You'd have done the same." Davis looked at him for a moment, then looked at Eleanor, then back at Silas. "Yes," he said. "I would have." He put his hat on. "Get well." He left. Eleanor watched him go, then looked at Silas, who was watching the door with the expression of a man who found this kind of exchange both necessary and uncomfortable. "You can't take a thank you, can you?" she said. "I can take a thank you." "Davis just tried to give you one and you deflected it twice." "That wasn't a deflection. That was—" He paused. "It was just the truth." "Sometimes the truth and a deflection are the same sentence," she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as the one that meant she'd said something he was going to think about for 3 days before he admitted she had a point. December settled over the ranch, and with it the particular quiet of a place that has been through something and come out the other side still standing. The hands went back to their rhythms. The cattle were accounted for. The kitchen turned out bread every morning, and the smell of it reached the bunkhouse and the main house, and apparently Pete told her one afternoon, could be detected at the property line on a still day, which he said without irony and which she chose to take as a compliment. It was in this period of recovery, Silas mending, the ranch resettling, the days growing short and cold, that Eleanor found the ledgers. She had not been looking for them. That needed to be stated plainly, because the way events arranged themselves afterward had a quality that could be made to look like intention, and it was not intention. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after they'd brought Silas back from the mountain, and she'd gone into the storage room at the back of the main house looking for the spare lamp oil because the kitchen lamp was running low. The storage room was a long, low-ceilinged space that held the accumulated practical miscellany of a working ranch: tools, spare harness, winter supplies, boxes of things that had been put away for later and then forgotten about. She found the lamp oil on the second shelf. On her way out, she knocked over a wooden box that had been balanced imprecisely on the edge of the third shelf. It hit the floor, and the lid came off, and several papers spilled out, and she crouched down to gather them back up, because that was what you did. She picked up the first paper and looked at it. Then she looked at it more carefully. It was a property transfer document, the kind the county clerk's office produced. She recognized the format from the paperwork Gerald Pratt had shown her when she'd first leased the building on Ridgeline Street. But the signature at the bottom was not right. She'd seen property transfer documents. The signatures were notarized, witnessed, dated. This one had the shape of all those things, but something in the proportions was wrong. The ink distribution wrong. The way the witness signature sat on the line slightly misaligned with the printed label below it. She looked at the name in the transfer. William R. Sandow, transferring property at 14 Ridgeline Street, Blackstone Ridge, to Territorial Land and Commerce Company as of November 3rd, 1883. She knew that building. It was the dry goods store 2 doors down from where her bakery had been. It belonged to a man named Sandow, who'd been in business there for 11 years. She looked at the date. November 3rd. Sandow had been at the harvest supper on November 3rd. She remembered because he'd been seated across from her and had talked at length about a new delivery contract he'd just signed. A man who had just sold his building did not talk about new delivery contracts. She sat on the floor of the storage room for a moment with the document in her hands. Then she went through the rest of the box. There were 14 documents, 14 property transfers, all in Blackstone Ridge, all to the Territorial Land and Commerce Company, all signed between October and January. She knew by sight or by reputation at least 9 of the properties listed. 2 of them she was nearly certain had not been sold: the Garvey building on 2nd Street, the mill property at the north end of town. 3 others she had only passing knowledge of and couldn't say with confidence either way, but 9 was enough. She sat in the cold storage room for a long time. Then she got up, put the documents back in the box, carried the box out to the kitchen table, and started reading every page more carefully than she'd read anything in a long time. She showed Silas that evening. He sat at the table in the kitchen and went through the documents one by one, slowly, with the focus of a man who was not going to react until he understood what he was looking at. Eleanor stood at the oven because she was too restless to sit, making coffee she didn't need, watching him read. When he finished the last page, he set it down. "Where did you find these?" "Storage room, back shelf. They were in a box that looked like it had been put there to be forgotten. They weren't Gerald Pratt's. He sold the building. He wouldn't have documents on the others." "No," Eleanor said. "I don't think these came from Pratt." She'd been thinking about this since the afternoon. "I think someone put them there. Someone who needed them somewhere they wouldn't be looked for." Silas looked at her. "Aldrich Cole's operation has been through this ranch. His surveying men last spring. They came through with a survey team assessing the South Road. I let them through." He paused. "One of them was in the main house for about an hour. I was out with the cattle." The silence that followed had a particular texture. "They used your property as a hiding place," she said, "until they needed them." She pulled out a chair and sat down. 14 transfers. 9 of them, I'm almost certain, are forged. These are people's businesses, Silas. Their land. If Cole has been filing these with the county, then people have been losing property they didn't sell. And they may not even know it yet. She spread her hands flat on the table. Or they know something is wrong and they can't prove it because they don't have what's in this box. He looked at the documents, looked at her. "This is dangerous," he said. "Shane, Cole has lawyers and connections in Denver. If we take this to the wrong person, then we take it to the right person. Which is who exactly? She'd been thinking about that too. Not the county clerk. Cole could have influence there. That's how the filings got through. Not the sheriff alone. He can't act without evidence presented properly. She paused. There's a town meeting Thursday. The whole council will be there. Half the property owners in town. You want to go public with it? I want to put the documents in front of the people they affect most, she said. If it's one person going to the sheriff, Cole can discredit them or delay things long enough to move the paperwork. If it's 14 property owners looking at forged signatures with their names on them in front of the whole town, she stopped. He can't discredit 14 people at once. Silas was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the gesture she knew by now, and looked at the table. You'd be the one presenting it, he said. Yes. Cole has money and he has people. If this goes wrong, then it goes wrong, she said. But people have been losing what they built. She heard her own voice go quiet and certain in a way that was separate from feeling. I know what that's like. He looked at her steadily for a long time. I'm coming with you, he said. I know you are, she said. Thursday came in gray and bitterly cold, the kind of January day that drove people inside and kept them there. The town meeting was held in the Blackstone Ridge Grange Hall, a wide-framed building on the west end of Ridgeline Street that smelled of sawdust and old wood smoke and the accumulated traces of every gathering it had ever hosted. It held roughly 60 people when full. By 7 in the evening, it held close to 70, which meant people were standing against the back wall, and the air inside was thick with body heat and the general restlessness of a crowd that had been told something was on the agenda without being told exactly what. Eleanor arrived with Silas and Pete Dalloway. She was carrying the box. She dressed carefully, which she acknowledged to herself was probably not rational, but felt necessary anyway. Not formally. She didn't own anything formal, but cleanly, with her hair done properly, rather than tucked back in the working arrangement she wore every day. She was not sure exactly what she was doing, only that she was going to stand in front of these people and say something that mattered, and she wanted her appearance to communicate that she knew it mattered. Aldrich Cole was already there. She'd expected that. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with the clothes and posture of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in whatever room he entered. He was seated near the front, talking to two men she didn't recognize, and he glanced at Eleanor when she came in with the look of a man who had filed her in a category and didn't anticipate revising it. Council Chairman Reed Albright called the meeting to order at 7:15 with a gavel that needed more force than he gave it, then tried again. The crowd settled into a modified version of quiet. There was routine business first: water rights on the North Creek, a road repair assessment, a complaint about noise from the freight yard that had been on the agenda for 2 months and would probably be there for 2 more. Eleanor waded through all of it. Beside her, Silas was still, which was the state he defaulted to when he was paying close attention. Any other business? Albright said, with the tone of a man who expected the answer to be no. Eleanor stood up. The box was in her hands. She walked to the front of the room without hurrying, because hurrying communicated panic, and she was not panicking. She was the most afraid she had been since she'd pushed open the door of the mountain cabin, and she moved through the fear the same way she'd moved through that, by focusing on the next specific thing instead of the whole of what was in front of her. Mrs. Mercer, Albright said, mildly surprised. I need a few minutes, she said. Please. He looked at her, looked at the box, looked at the room. Something in her manner communicated enough that he sat back and gestured. She set the box on the table where the council sat and took out the first document. This is a property transfer, she said. She kept her voice level and projected it clearly, the way you learn to do in a large room. It's dated November 3rd of last year, and it transfers the property at 14 Ridgeline Street from William Sandow to the Territorial Land and Commerce Company. She heard movement in the crowd. She didn't look for Cole. Mr. Sandow, she said, are you here tonight? A pause. Then, from the middle of the room, I'm here. Did you sell your building in November? The silence that followed had weight. I did not, Sandow said. She put the document down and picked up the next one. She went through them methodically. She didn't editorialize, didn't raise her voice, didn't look at Cole. She simply read the name on each document and asked the question, and the people whose names appeared answered it, one by one, from various places in the room. She didn't have all 14 confirmed. 3 names were not represented in the hall that evening. But she had 9 people who stood or spoke from their seats and said, in one form or another, that they had not signed what their names said they had signed. By the 7th document, the room had the particular quality of a space where something has shifted irrevocably. A low undercurrent of voices, a physical repositioning of people in their seats, the way attention changes texture when it goes from interested to activated. Cole stood up when she reached the 8th document. "I'd like to say something," he said. He had a voice that had been trained for rooms, authoritative, controlled, the voice of a man who expected it to settle things. "You'll have your turn," Albright said, which surprised Eleanor slightly. She didn't look away from the document. "This is highly irregular," Cole said. "This woman has no legal standing to present these—" "Mr. Cole." Albright's voice had found some authority it hadn't had earlier in the evening. "Sit down." A pause that stretched long enough to mean something. Then Cole sat. Eleanor put down the 8th document and picked up the 9th. When she was done, she looked up at the room. "I found these documents on my property," she said. "I don't know how they got there. I know what they say, and I know what the people whose names are on them have told this room tonight." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not the sheriff. What I am is someone who had her own building sold out from under her and who spent a long time thinking it was just bad luck." She looked at the box, then back at the room. It might not have been. She picked up the box and stepped back from the table. The room erupted. Not violently. There was no single dramatic moment. It was more like a pressure that had been building, releasing all at once. Conversations breaking out everywhere simultaneously. People turning to each other. Sandow pushing forward toward the council table. 2 other men she didn't recognize following closely behind. Cole was on his feet again, but the men he'd been talking to earlier had moved slightly away from him, which was the specific kind of physical distancing that happened when a person's proximity became a liability. Silas appeared at Eleanor's elbow. He said nothing. He just stood beside her in the way that he had, which was enough. Pete Dalloway, behind them both, said under his breath, "Well, that went about as expected." "Was that good or bad?" Eleanor said. "I genuinely have no idea," Pete said, "but I don't think he's walking out of here the same way he walked in." He was right about that. Cole left before the meeting formally adjourned. He left with his 2 companions and without speaking to the council, which everyone present understood to mean something even if they couldn't have articulated exactly what. The sheriff, a quiet, careful man named Broder, who had been listening from the back wall the entire time, came forward as Cole's departure cleared space, and he and Albright and 3 of the property owners gathered around the council table and began talking in the low, focused voices of people who have just received information that changes their immediate plans. Eleanor stood to the side and watched it happen. She was shaking slightly, which she was aware of and which she hoped was not visible. It wasn't the dramatic aftermath she might have imagined, if she'd imagined it at all. It was just people in a cold hall on a January night, rearranging their understanding of the last several months, talking fast and seriously about what came next. Vera Hollis materialized beside her at some point. "You knew the Sandow transfer was forged," Vera said. It was not a question. "I was fairly sure." "How?" "He talked about a new delivery contract at the Harvest Supper. On the same day the document says he transferred his building. A man who just sold his property doesn't take on new contracts." Vera looked at her with an expression Eleanor hadn't seen from her before. "You noticed that and held it." "I didn't know I was holding it until I saw the document," Eleanor said. Then it fit. Vera was quiet for a moment. "Agnes Pruitt is going to have a terrible time with this," she said. Eleanor looked at her. "She'll have to completely revise her opinion of you," Vera said. "It'll take her months. The effort will be visible." It was the most obliquely warm thing Vera had ever said to her. Eleanor recognized it as such. "I'm devastated for her," Eleanor said. Something that was unmistakably a smile crossed Vera Hollis's face, brief and genuine, before she rearranged it back into its normal configuration. Outside, the January night was sharp and clear, the stars the same hard, cold brightness they'd been on the morning Eleanor and Pete had ridden up into the mountains. Silas brought the wagon around, and she climbed up beside him, and Pete settled into the back with his coat pulled up around his ears. They rode the first mile in silence. "You all right?" Silas said. "I'm still shaking," she said. "You didn't look it." "I was." He was quiet for a moment. The horse moved steadily in the dark, the road familiar enough that neither of them was thinking about navigation. "That took courage," he said. She almost deflected it, the way she usually did when someone said something direct about her that she didn't know how to receive. She stopped herself. "Yes," she said. It did. He didn't say anything else. She didn't either. In the back of the wagon, Pete Dalloway had pulled his hat over his face, which was either sleep or a very convincing performance of it. The Double M came into view eventually. The low shape of the buildings in the dark, the light in the bunkhouse window, the particular quality of a place that has been lived in long enough to feel like it knows you're coming. Eleanor carried the empty box inside and set it on the kitchen table. She stood in her kitchen, the kitchen she'd built on land she hadn't expected to be on, in a life she hadn't expected to be living. And she felt the shaking finally slow, the way adrenaline left the body when there was nothing left for it to do. The starter was in its crock on the shelf. She checked it automatically, the way she checked it every night, the same gesture she'd made 10,000 times. It was doing what it always did, growing slowly, reliably, in the dark. She covered it back up and went to bed. The legal process was nothing like the town meeting. The town meeting had been fast and charged and human, people standing up in real time, voices overlapping, the room shifting as understanding moved through it like weather. What followed was slow and institutional and frequently maddening, and Eleanor had to make her peace with that, or it would have driven her into the ground. Sheriff Broder turned out to be a more thorough man than his quietness suggested. He took the documents the same night of the meeting, signed a receipt for them in his careful handwriting, and spent the next 3 weeks building a case with the methodical patience of someone who understood that a rushed case against a man with Denver lawyers was a lost case. He interviewed every property owner named in the documents. He sent correspondence to the county recorder's office and to a territorial judge he apparently trusted. He did not arrest Aldrich Cole, which frustrated half the town, and he explained to Eleanor when she came to ask about it directly that an arrest without sufficient grounds would give Cole's attorneys exactly the opening they needed to have everything dismissed. "You want it to stick," he said. "I want it to stick," she confirmed. "Then let me do it the right way." She did. It was one of the harder things she'd done, and she'd done some difficult things recently. Cole had left Blackstone Ridge the morning after the town meeting. His men had been seen loading wagons before dawn, which was the action of someone who knew the next several days were not going to be hospitable. He'd gone back to Denver, and for a period of about 6 weeks, it appeared to half the town that he had simply escaped, that the distance and the lawyers and the machinery of money would absorb what had happened in the Grange Hall and reduce it to nothing. Eleanor didn't believe that. She didn't know that she was right not to believe it. It was possible Cole would evade consequence. It happened often enough in the world that only a fool would rule it out entirely. But she had put 14 documents in front of 60 people, and 9 of those people had stood up or spoken from their seats, and she had decided to believe that 60 witnesses to a thing was harder to make disappear than one. She was right, as it turned out, but she didn't know that yet for a while, and the while was uncomfortable. In February, the territorial judge appointed a county examiner to review the property transfers. The examiner was a small, precise man from Colorado Springs who arrived with a leather satchel and an expression of professional neutrality and spent 11 days in Blackstone Ridge going through records. He interviewed Eleanor twice. He interviewed Sandow and 4 other property owners, and the county clerk and 2 people she didn't recognize who had arrived from Denver and conducted their business without explaining themselves to anyone. On the 11th day, he left without announcing his conclusions, which was apparently standard procedure and which Eleanor found deeply frustrating. The conclusions arrived 5 weeks later in the form of a document sent to Sheriff Broder, who sent word to Eleanor, who came to the sheriff's office on a cold Tuesday morning in late March and read it, standing at his desk because she couldn't make herself sit down. 11 of the 14 transfers had been determined fraudulent. The remaining 3 were under continued review. Aldrich Cole had been formally charged with fraud and forgery under territorial law. 2 of his associates had been charged as well. The properties were to be restored to their lawful owners pending the completion of the legal process, which the document noted could take an additional several months. She read it twice. 11, she said. 11 confirmed, Broder said. Likely more when the review finishes. She set the document down on his desk. Her hands were steady, which surprised her slightly. "My building," she said. The one on Ridgeline Street. Is in the 11, Broder said. She nodded. She'd thought it probably was, but she had been careful not to assume. What happens to it? It goes back to Gerald Pratt. The sale to Cole's company is voided. He paused. What happens after that is between you and Pratt. She thought about this building on Ridgeline Street, the flour sack curtains she'd hemmed crooked, the 4 tables, the chalkboard with its blocky lettering. She thought about whether she wanted to go back to it. She thought about the kitchen on the Double M, the east-facing window, and the morning light on the work counter, and the way the bread smelled differently out here than it had in town. Bigger somehow, more open, as if the air itself was less confined. Thank you, she said to Broder. She walked back to the wagon in the thin March light and sat in it for a moment before she picked up the reins. She didn't want to go back. She realized it fully and clearly, sitting in the wagon outside the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning, and it had the quality of something she'd actually known for a while without quite letting herself say it. The bakery on Ridgeline Street had been what she had, the only thing she'd had for a long time, and she had held onto it with both hands and poured herself into it because losing it felt like losing the last version of herself she recognized. But that was before. Before the Double M and the kitchen with the east window and the bread that smelled different out here, and 7 ranch hands who drank coffee at her table in the mornings, and told her things about the land that she'd been putting in her bones gradually, the way water gets into stone. She picked up the reins and headed home. Gerald Pratt came to see her in April. He came to the ranch, which she suspected cost him something. He was a town man, not comfortable on working land, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said that the building was his again, and that he felt, given the circumstances, that he owed her the first offer on a new lease. She looked at him for a moment. I appreciate that, she said, but I'm not coming back to Ridgeline Street. He blinked. You're going to give up the bakery? I'm going to expand it, she said. Here. She'd been working on the plan since February, which was a measure of how certain she'd been even before she'd admitted it to herself. The storage building was already functioning as a proper kitchen. What she'd been turning over was the question of what came next. Whether the next thing was simply personal production, bread for the ranch, and a few regular orders from people in town who'd been asking, or whether it was something larger. She talked to Silas about it one evening, laid it out the way she laid most things out, directly, without softening the rough edges. I want to build a proper room off the kitchen, she said. Tables. Not many. Maybe 6. For the hands who want somewhere better than the bunkhouse to eat. And for travelers coming off the South Road. We're the first working property they hit after the Ridge Pass. They're going to be cold and hungry. Silas had looked at the kitchen building and then at her. That's not a bakery anymore. That's a cookhouse. It's both, she said. I know bread. I'll learn the rest. Clyde's not going to love this. Clyde is tired, she said. I've watched him. He's been doing it too long and he doesn't enjoy it anymore. He can stay on and help, or he can have less to do. Either way, I'm not taking his job. I'm building something next to it. Silas turned the matter over in the way he turned things over, slowly, without rushing to a position. What do you need from me? Lumber and labor to build the room. I'll cover the rest. With what? I have savings, she said. Not all of it went into the original bakery. He looked at her. How long have you had this figured out? Long enough, she said. He almost smiled. All right. The room went up in May, when the ground was soft enough to work properly, and the weather had decided to behave. It was not a beautiful room. It was a practical room, board-framed and solid, with 6 tables and a stone fireplace on the north wall, and 2 windows on the south side that let in the afternoon light. Eleanor hung curtains from proper fabric this time, though she still hemmed them herself, and they still came out slightly uneven, which she had accepted was simply a fact about her and hemming. Tom Mercer came home from Denver in June. He arrived on the afternoon stage, a 13-year-old who was tall for his age and who had his father's quietness and his father's careful eyes and absolutely none of his father's patience with silence, which Eleanor discovered within approximately 40 minutes of meeting him. He talked. Not nervously. He simply had things to say and said them. And he was curious about everything in the way that well-educated children were curious, with a precision that made questions feel like genuine inquiries rather than politeness. He came to her kitchen the first morning after his arrival, which she had not expected, and stood in the doorway and said, Dad said you're a baker. I am. He said you're good. He said that? He said the bread is good. Tom corrected himself with the pedantry of a boy who'd been well schooled. He talks about the bread a lot. She handed him a cup of coffee, which he accepted with the seriousness of someone who'd recently decided he was old enough for it. Do you bake? She asked. No, I'm bad at it. He sat down at the table without being invited, which she found she didn't mind. I'm good at arithmetic, and I'm decent at Latin, and I can ride better than most boys at school. Those are good things to be. Dad thinks so. He drank his coffee with a focused expression. Are you going to stay? She looked at him. Am I going to stay where? Here, on the ranch. He said it without looking up from the cup, in the tone of a child asking something he'd been holding for a while. Dad's had people come and go. He doesn't say much about it, but I can tell. I'm going to stay, she said. He glanced up then, assessed her with those careful eyes. Okay, he said, and went back to his coffee. That was, she thought, about as much of a welcome as she was going to get from a 13-year-old boy whose father had remarried while he was away at school, and she decided it was sufficient. Danny Cruz came out to the ranch twice a week through the summer months. His reading had reached the point where Eleanor had given him a proper novel, a copy of Robinson Crusoe that she'd ordered through the supply catalog, and he was moving through it with the tenacious focus he applied to everything. He and Tom Mercer met on a Tuesday afternoon in July and sized each other up with the territorial caution of boys who hadn't decided yet whether the other one was worth their time. Eleanor watched it from the kitchen doorway. Tom was quicker with words. Danny was quicker with his hands. He could fix a harness in the time it took Tom to explain why the existing knot was wrong. By the end of the afternoon, they were behind the barn arguing about something with the comfortable energy of two people who'd found their respective grounds and decided the other one was interesting enough to push against. She went back to the bread. Some things arranged themselves. It was an evening in late July when Silas told her the thing about October. They were in the kitchen after supper, which had become their time, the ranch settling down around them, the long summer light finally going off, the two of them at the table with whatever was left of the coffee and whatever was left of the day. Tom was in the main house reading. The hands were in the bunkhouse. It was one of those evenings that had the quality of a door that had been left ajar, open enough for something to come through if it wanted to. Silas had been quiet for a while, which was not unusual, but there was a quality to the quiet that was different from his usual quiet. She'd learned to read the difference. I want to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. When I came into the bakery in October, he said, the first time. I remember. It wasn't for the coffee. He turned the cup in his hands once, then set it down and left it there. I knew who you were before I came in. I'd seen you at the harvest supper the year before. You were at the far table, and you were arguing with someone about something, I don't remember what, and you had a look on your face like— He paused, choosing the word carefully. Like you meant it, whatever you were saying, like you meant everything you said and you weren't going to adjust that for anyone. He looked at the table. I thought about it for a year. Eleanor was very still. I came up with reasons to be in town, he said. Supply runs, mostly. And I kept telling myself if I happened to pass by, I'd stop in. And then one morning, I just went in. He looked up at her. I didn't have a reason prepared. I ordered coffee because it was the first thing I could think of. She looked at him for a long moment. You came back twice a week for 6 months, she said. Yes. And you never said anything? No. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because I didn't know what to say. And because saying it wrong felt worse than not saying it. A pause. I'm aware that's not a flattering answer. It's an honest answer, she said. He reached into his coat pocket, the gesture of someone retrieving something they've been carrying for a while, and put something on the table between them. The handkerchief. Dark navy, initialed SM, the thread faded from whatever it had once been. She looked at it, then at him. You left it on purpose, she said. It was not quite a question. I needed a reason to come back, he said, and I was running out of excuses. Something crossed his face that was the closest she'd ever seen him come to embarrassed. It was not my most dignified moment. She picked up the handkerchief, held it. She thought about the windowsill above the stairs where she'd kept it for 2 weeks, walking past it every night and every morning and telling herself she wasn't attaching meaning to it. She thought about counting the days and telling herself she wasn't counting. You could have just come back, she said. I know that now. You knew it then too. Yes, he said, but I needed the excuse more than I needed to know it. She looked at him across the table. This difficult, quiet, honest man who had thought about her for a year and then walked into her bakery and ordered coffee and come back twice a week for 6 months and left his handkerchief behind because he needed a reason. Who had asked her to marry him badly and said so himself. Who had been terrible at accepting thanks and worse at asking for help, and who had held her hand for a moment in a kitchen at 4:30 in the morning before a cattle drive and said 5 days like a promise. You're an idiot, she said. Not unkindly. I know, he said. A year, she said. You thought about it for a year. It's a significant decision. You could have introduced yourself at the harvest supper. I know. That would have saved everyone a great deal of time and discomfort. I know, Eleanor. She set the handkerchief down, looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him, and she thought about what she'd been at the beginning of all this. The woman behind the flour, the furniture, the sad case, the widow who was 30 and therefore done, according to the arithmetic of people who hadn't asked her. She thought about $12 and shaking hands and a cast-iron oven that burned the bread slightly on the bottom. She thought about fear that she'd spent 4 years calling stubbornness because stubbornness was easier to live with. She thought about what it meant that she'd survived all of it, not transformed by it. She was not a different person than she'd been. She was the same person who hemmed curtains crooked and burned the bottom crust and couldn't take a compliment cleanly and had thrown open a mountain cabin door because waiting for a search party was not something she was capable of. The same person, just more of herself. More certain of the shape of herself, the way you got more certain of a road the more times you walked it. You know what I think, she said. What? I think the next time you spend a year thinking about something, you should spend 11 months less on it. He looked at her. Tell me sooner, she said. Whatever it is. The things you turn over in that head of yours for months before you say them. Say them earlier. I can take it. I'll try, he said. That's all I'm asking. That's all I'm... He picked up the handkerchief from the table and held it for a moment, and then he reached across and put it in her hand, and she understood that this was him keeping it said, not taking it back, not treating the conversation as finished and therefore filed away. He was giving her the evidence of it to hold. She folded it once and put it in her apron pocket. Outside, the summer dark had come down fully, the sky above the Colorado plain thick with stars. Somewhere in the main house, Tom was probably still reading. In the bunkhouse, Pete was likely asleep with his hat over his face. On the south road, the first autumn travelers were probably already coming down from the ridge pass, cold and hungry, not yet knowing that there was a kitchen at the first ranch off the high country road where the bread came out every morning and the coffee was strong and the welcome was unspectacular and genuine. The dining room opened in September, not with a ceremony. Eleanor didn't hold with ceremonies that she hadn't specifically asked for. It opened the way most real things opened, which was gradually, with the first traveler stopping because he saw the light in the window and smelled something worth stopping for, and then a second one the following day, and then word moving along the south road the way word moved on roads, slowly at first, then faster than you'd expect. By October, she had a regular midday crowd that included ranch hands from 3 neighboring properties, 2 families who came from town on Fridays because the drive was worth it, and a rotating population of travelers who were making note of the double M in the way that useful places got noted, not in any official register, just in the memory of people who'd been cold and hungry and then hadn't been. Danny came by on a Saturday in October and returned Robinson Crusoe with the care of someone handling a thing they'd borrowed and wanted to return in better condition than they'd received it, which he mostly had. He'd folded one page corner, which Eleanor decided not to comment on. What's next? He asked. She had a copy of David Copperfield on the shelf. She'd been saving it. This, she said. It's longer and harder. Some of it is going to frustrate you. He took it with the expression of someone accepting a challenge. How long? Months, probably, if you're also working. He looked at the cover. Okay. Amos Harmon has been treating you better? She asked. She'd checked indirectly through Pete, because she didn't want to embarrass Danny by asking straight out. He's teaching me the cattle accounting, Danny said. Numbers. He paused. I'm good at numbers. I know you are. He says if I keep at it, I can be a foreman before I'm 20. She looked at him. This boy who had shown up before sunrise in a coat too big for him and boots that didn't match, who had learned to read the word danger before he learned the word home, who now carried a pocket dictionary against his chest and read novels and talked about being a foreman before he was 20 with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had decided that the world contained possibilities that were available to him. "You'll be a good one," she said. He looked up at her with the expression she'd seen that first morning he read a complete sentence, the surprise that good things were real and not tricks. "You think so?" "I know so," she said. He put the book under his arm and went back to the Harmon Ranch, and Eleanor watched him go from the kitchen doorway, and she thought about what it actually meant to change a life. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in the slow accumulated way of showing up before sunrise and being there when someone small and overlooked needed someone to pay attention. Nobody became who they were in a single moment. That was the thing nobody told you, and maybe the most important thing. James's death had not made her who she was. The bakery had not made her who she was. The mountain and the town meeting and the decision to say yes on a Thursday morning, none of these alone made her who she was. It was all of it, each thing pressing on the next, the ordinary and the unbearable and the quietly good, all of it running together the way the creek ran in spring, too much water to see where any single drop had come from. She was not who she'd been. She was not who she'd planned to be. She was something she'd built from available materials in conditions she hadn't chosen, and it was imperfect and specifically hers, and she had stopped apologizing for the rough edges. Agnes Pruitt came by the ranch in November. It was a Friday, which was one of the days the dining room filled up with families from town, and Mrs. Pruitt arrived in the company of Frances Collier, who Eleanor now knew was the voice she'd heard through the storeroom wall all those months ago. They came in with the slightly stiff posture of women who had prepared themselves to be gracious about something they hadn't entirely expected to admire. Eleanor showed them to a table. She did not mention the storeroom. She did not mention part of the furniture or someone younger or any of the other things she had folded up and put away a long time ago. She brought bread and coffee and a plate of the apple hand pies she'd started making again now that the kitchen had the space for them, and she treated Agnes Pruitt exactly as she'd always treated her, with the particular neutral courtesy of a woman who provided a service and declined to perform warmth she didn't feel. Mrs. Pruitt ate the bread without commenting on the bottom crust. She ate the apple pie and set down her fork and looked around the dining room. The table's full, the fireplace going, the morning light through the south windows landing on everything in that particular way it did in this room that Eleanor had noticed and privately thought was one of the best things about the place. "This is very nice," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Thank you," Eleanor said. A pause. "You've done well here," Mrs. Pruitt said. The words came out with the slight effortfulness of someone assembling a sentence that was not quite natural to them yet. "I have," Eleanor said. She said it simply, without deflection, and she let it be the complete truth that it was. She went back to the kitchen. That winter Silas built a proper sign for the road, because enough travelers had been asking what the place was called that the absence of a name had become its own kind of answer. He brought it to her one evening, to rough pine board, the letters burned in with a fire iron, and set it on the table. She looked at it. Double M Kitchen. Eleanor Mercer. She ran her finger over the letters. "You put my name on it," she said. "It's your kitchen," he said. She looked at the sign for a long moment. There was something almost unbearably straightforward about it. No flourish, no sentiment, just a fact. Her name on a board, in burned letters, on land she hadn't known a year ago, over a kitchen she'd built from scratch for the second time in her life. "It's good," she said. "I can do it again if you want something different." "No," she said. "It's right." They put it up on the South Road the following Saturday, Silas and Pete digging the post hole in the frozen ground, while Eleanor stood to the side and told them it was crooked, which it was slightly, and which neither of them fully corrected despite her instructions. She left it slightly crooked. It was visible from the road. It said what it needed to say. That was enough.
Oh, this is all quicksand, but I can see the main entrance. Right.
Oh shit.
Yeah, don't go that way at all. I see it's right there, like right on the other side of this road.
Okay.
See it when you're right.
Oh, yeah. We just gotta wait for the Fury by absolute consequence of entropy.
Chandler!
You
why are you keeping him?
motherfucker, bro. Alright, I guess we can say TP us if we have these. Alright, let's get in there.
Oh, Chandler, CP me.
You will. There's a storm thing over here. He's actually TPing
God,
you.
he's doing it.
Zerchi, I'm not gonna lie, there's no fucking way I figure out how to get back.
I picked up his walkie-talkie, I kind of just left it there.
Well, I guess it's too late. This place looks scary as fuck. Alright. It's bones. It's actually body parts.
If you go straight, like, there's like a shit ton of shit in there.
I can hear something walking around.
No, I don't see any red dots right now.
Okay, keep me updated. I can hear something. It's
In there.
everything I'm seeing right now is just body parts. It's like bones and feet. It's all corpses. It's all body parts. Everything is body parts in here.
How much they sell them for?
Like 11. It's all fucking cheap. It's all body parts.
You're right.
Knees are kind of valuable.
If you go to that room right there, there's just a cigarette.
It's a foot. What the fuck?
There's two things at the end, and that's dead end.
It's all just body parts. There's no loot items. A tongue? This ribcage is worth quite a bit. This is fucked up, man.